Hi, I'm Doug Cha, Executive Director of the Governance Center here at the Conference Board. Welcome to today's book author webcast. Today I'm very pleased to have David Weber, professor of law at the Boston University School of Law, and we'll be talking about his book today, The Rise of Working Class Shareholder, Labor's Last Best Weapon. And it was released this year by the Harvard University Press, and it's been getting a lot of attention in the media, on C-SPAN, Bloomberg, NPR, among other major news outlets. Looking forward to hearing about David's work, the evolving power of the labor pension funds as activists, and the implication on this power could have on the market and corporate governance. So before we begin, I just want to give you a couple housekeeping notes. We welcome your questions and comments. If you have questions for me or David, please email them to us at the end of the session, and we'll get back to you. Our email address will appear on the last slide for your reference. And so now, without further ado, let me get started. David Weber is a professor of law at Boston University Law School, where he focuses on civil procedure, securities regulation, and shareholder activism. He's frequently interviewed on corporate governance and securities law issues. Dave, thanks so much for joining us and being here in New York today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, Rise of the Working Class Shareholder. I guess before we get into the book, let's talk a little bit about your own career background.
Sure. Well, after law school, I practiced law here in New York for several years. I was a corporate and securities litigator at some of the, traditional corporate law firms here in New York. And then I did a brief stint actually at a plaintiff side class action firm, which brought sort of securities fraud and deal cases. And I did that work before ultimately transitioning into academia. So I did have some litigation experience here in New York City before making that transition to academia.
And so you've worked essentially on both sides of representing corporations and plaintiffs in securities litigation, derivative suits, class actions, etc.
Exactly right. I started off sort of doing more traditional corporate litigation defense work. I did a little bit of work on behalf of investor class actions, which is what initially brought me into contact with the kinds of activists that I describe in the book. A lot of the clients bringing those suits were big pension funds, labor union funds. And so when I started my academic career, I really spent time focusing specifically on their litigation activity, the kinds of suits they brought, how effective they were or were not in representing shareholders. And then gradually I expanded really to look beyond just their litigation activity and look more broadly at sort of all the other activism that they were engaging in, the shareholder activism, the proxy stuff, and so on and so forth.
So it sounds like that's essentially what prompted you to write this book, your interest in that from your exposure to that type of activity.
I think that's exactly right. When I was struck by the fact of, even in the brief stint we're doing some of that class action work, as I said, a lot of these were pension funds and labor union funds, and it was a very interesting mix. You would be in these, say, settlement negotiations or talking with clients, whatever, and you'd have lawyers and you'd have bankers and you'd have accountants in the room. But then you might also have teachers or a sheriff or some kind of public accountant, a public employee overseeing their pension funds. And in a way, I was very struck, and positively so, by the role that I thought these folks were just playing, just by virtue of being in the room and asking some questions. I think that, in a way, the analogy in my mind is almost like the role of a jury in a courtroom, is bringing a sort of a more democratic sensibility into this space, and just finding that voice inside what is usually a more in sort of more of a corporate bubble where you don't get a lot of voice from folks like that, was very interesting to me. And as an academic, it's something that I spent a lot of time, really the bulk of my career to date, following up on and studying.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never realized that, in those settings you actually have some of the pensioners in the room, and I'm sure, yeah, it has definitely effect on the dynamic. So,
Yes.
yeah. So your title, "The Rise of the Working Class Shareholder." What do what's the definition of working class shareholder, and what's the idea behind that term?
Sure. Well, in the narrowest sense, I basically was really trying to focus specifically on the activism of these public pension funds and these labor union funds. That's really how I define working class shareholder. For the most part, what's the profile of the people contributing to these funds? Who are the folks whose retirement savings are at stake in these funds? Well, in the public sector, it's cops, it's firefighters, it's teachers, it's state and local government employees. And for the most part, these folks are somewhere in the range of middle to working class. You could really go down a rabbit hole of sort of endless definitions of where does one end and the other begin. But by and large, people in lower to middle income ranges, saving for retirement through the pension funds. In the private sector, you would have, say, carpenters, building trades, union types, other folks like that. So my definition of working class shareholder really just tries to target kind of that group and these particular institutions. It's not a perfect definition. You could find people who fit the definition of working class who have a 401k or have their investment in a mutual fund. But by and large, I think it really works. And I think it also helps explain some of their behavior. I mean, I think that public pension funds and labor union funds are coming from a different market segment and catering to different constituents than I think many big mutual funds are, certainly than, say, hedge funds or private equity funds or others are. And so I thought it was worth, particularly when you recognize what a disproportionately large role they play in activism, in litigation, I think that we needed to look at them a little bit separately from the rest of the market.
And so, I guess the what comes out is you say this is labor's last best weapon.
Yeah.
And so I guess the implication there is this is part of a whole collection of tactics that labor unions use in order to influence corporations. So what are how do you compare the shareholder route, the investor route, to some of the other tactics that labor uses in terms of effectiveness?
Well, one of the clear, it's no secret that labor unions in particular have been in sharp decline in this country for decades. That statement is backed up by just about every data point you can imagine, the rates of unionization, the size of unions, so on and so forth. And if you go back and compare to them now to their heyday in, say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I think that they are much diminished. That isn't to say that they aren't still important. They are still very important, and many of the traditional tools that they have used, strikes, organization drives. We've seen recent success with the fight for 15 in certain places for a minimum wage. Those tools are still important in the 21st century. But I think it is increasingly the case, as capital markets have become so much larger and more powerful and operate globally, that if you don't have a voice inside capital markets, doesn't matter how good your political ground game is, doesn't matter how strong your legislative or your litigation agenda is, if you don't have voice in capital markets, which so often establish the facts on the ground, it's too late by the time you get to your strike, your lawsuit, your legislative initiative, in many instances. And so part of what I'm doing in the book is sort of describing how at least some aspects of labor, and I wouldn't, by the way, I don't use the term just to refer to unions because public pension funds aren't necessarily all unionized, et cetera, but I think the basic idea is labor, and I think it's a fair one. I think increasingly, as with everyone else, labor and workers and others have to think about having capital strategies too. And so that's really one of the sort of arguments and stories I'm trying to tell in this book.
Yeah, I guess our society has become so financialized that, if you're not in that system and trying to, work from within the financial and capital market system, as you say, you're at a tremendous disadvantage.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody, the growth of finance, the growth of financialization, the fact that we lead increasingly financed lives. You know, a retirement, a life in retirement is a financed existence, right? And that's a good thing in a sense if you can afford it, and if you don't wind up starving or unable to afford basic needs. But that's right, and so I think that that these institutions have, at least some of them, and some of the activists that I portray in the book, have started to think about how they can advance the interests of their constituents through capital markets too.
And so, you know, in the book you talk about a number of a couple cases, specific cases where you know, labor funds, public pension funds, you know, took on specific corporations, Safeway, Home Depot, and you've studied, you know, all of the other high-profile ones. You know, the fact of the matter is, you don't have labor funds agitating for change at every single corporation. Every year there are a few.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what do you see kind of as the common thread of when the pension funds kind of spring into action and really kind of, you know, start to get vocal and start using their power as shareholders?
Sure. So I would say there's really two dimensions to this. One is the one that you just described. Specific things happen at specific companies. How do these activists go about thinking of which companies they're going to target? Then another piece of it, which I think we could touch on too, would be how sometimes they just pick certain issues and decide, we're going to explore these at 75 different companies at the same time. So I think they're operating on these two dimensions. Now, as to the one you just pointed out, sometimes they're looking, it reminds me a lot of litigation activism, reminds me a lot of, sometimes, let's face it, what prosecutors do or others. Sometimes there's a particular issue that you're concerned about. Let's say the disconnect between executive compensation and performance. Home Depot comes to mind there. You're concerned about that, and then you have a sort of a kind of a perfect storm where you've got an extreme outlier. Let's face it, also, it doesn't hurt to focus on a brand name. Home Depot is, you know, it's a household name. Everybody knows Home Depot. That certainly has to come to play when you're thinking about targeting a company like that versus another one that may not be quite as high profile. But the fact is, but the circumstances there were also, you know, you had a situation where you had an executive, the CEO, very highly compensated, basically guaranteed pay, and at the same time when Home Depot was faltering and losing market share to, say, a company like Lowe's. So it was a good example of the issue that they were worried about, the disconnect between pay and performance. Plus, add in the fact that here's a particularly extreme example, here's it happening at a high-profile company, and so I think that it was targeted for that reason.
And so, you know, you mentioned hedge funds before, and the whole financialization of our society. You know, hedge funds. You know, in the book, you note that institutional investor participation in hedge funds has quintupled in the years following the 1996 National Securities Market Improvement Act, and so. You know, this is something that obviously gets talked a lot about in the media in terms of just hedge funds and the growth and activity of hedge funds. But I guess what doesn't get talked about is that a lot of the labor and public pension funds have investments in these hedge funds or use them as managers of their money, and sometimes have you know, sometimes the motives and the end goals can come into conflict. Why don't you talk a little bit about that phenomenon?
Sure. Well, I think that the relationship between public pension funds and labor union funds and hedge funds is very fraught and very complicated, and problematic. One of the stories that I tell in the book was about CalPERS' decision to divest entirely from hedge funds. I spoke to a longtime SEIU activist named Danick Murphy I interviewed about and kind of tell the story of his kind of long-term campaign, ultimately successful, to get CalPERS out of hedge funds. Part of that really just comes down to sort of straight investment calculus of the performance simply not being there, relative at least to the fees that were being paid. Hedge funds as an investment have really been terrible as an asset class for over a decade now. They have consistently underperformed the market. And so even purely, particularly net of fees, we all know that there are certain standout funds, but at least overall, that's been the story of the funds. And so there are a number of dimensions. One is, should you get out of them entirely? A second has been to cut those fees, stay in and cut the fees. And then there's a third dimension, which is looking a little bit more broadly and is another story I tell in the book about a very interesting conflict between the American Federation of Teachers and Third Point's Dan Loeb, hedge fund, another prominent hedge fund, where what was becoming clear is that there were many hedge funds who were taking teacher pension money and then turning around and attacking teacher pensions. And the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, and at that time it was Dan Pedrati, who was running capital strategies for them, put out a list of hedge funds that were doing this, and that really surprised a lot of folks, and shook things up, and many hedge funds backed off and decided they're not going to do that kind of charter school work anymore. So you're exactly right. Part of it is just an investment story, and part of it is a broader sense that some of these hedge funds are playing a kind of a destructive role in undermining the very workers who were contributing and investing to them. So what to do about that? I think that we've seen there are different paths. One is to use your shareholder power to push back against hedge funds doing certain kinds of things that you don't want them to do. That's one piece of the story. The other, of course, is back to the question about fees and performance. But I don't know. In many respects, I think hedge funds as an asset class have yet to really make their case to pension funds and labor union funds, and increasingly, to an extent, we've seen at least some of them start to take their money elsewhere.
But I guess it was interesting when all the money was pouring in to hedge funds by, just in general, but also these pension funds, that, or at least the story was that pension funds were facing a underfunding crisis.
Right.
And their returns, the assumptions that they had made on their returns ended up being overly optimistic. And so in order to kind of make that up, they had to look at alternative investments that were a little bit more, aggressive, risky, and hedge funds kind of fell into that pile.
Yes.
So.
And that's exactly right. And I think that did motivate a lot of the money to go in post-financial crisis, in particular, when there was deep concern about funding levels, to go in and chase those alternatives. And I think overall, at least in the hedge fund space, it hasn't really been a very successful story, in part because of the performance, in part because of the fees. And now there are serious points here of reevaluation. Similar story in the private equity sphere, which is a little bit more complicated. I mean, one interesting development is that CalPERS, California Public Employee Retirement System, the largest, everybody knows CalPERS, now seems to be on the way to creating its own private equity fund and running one of those in-house. We have seen pension funds like some of the Canadian pension funds have done that. So some of it is a question of the business model. Some of it is a question of aligning private equity or hedge funds with your own values. And some of it is a question of simply maybe you're better off, if you're going to do projects like this, running it in-house and kind of cutting out the middleman. I think those are all interesting trends that we'll see, and they could move in different directions in the coming years. We'll see how it plays out.
So in that sense, all these funds are dealing with the same issues that everybody else is, in terms of large funds and, university funds, et cetera.
Sure.
A lot of them are just moving to indexing or funds of funds. But, so the cases that you talk about in terms of, the hedge fund or the hedge fund managers, they are, they have certain interests, say, in more charter schools, and that's essentially putting a lot of teachers out of business. Mm-hmm. And so the teachers are investing in something that's really kind of undermining their own existence. So that brings up another big issue with how pension funds, invest and then vote, which is, the concept of the duty of loyalty and the idea that, the fund managers should be working to really maximize the value of the fund. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, you have labor with interests in other types of issues, and how, to what extent can they factor in these other issues when they're making investment decisions and voting decisions. So you
Yes.
examined some of that. So maybe tell us a little
Sure.
bit about your analysis of that.
Well, hanging over this entire discussion is at least one background legal issue, exactly the one you described, which is the question of the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty is embedded in ERISA, the federal statute. It's also embedded in state pension codes that govern the state and city and county public pension funds involved here. And, the duty of loyalty, the exact language is that these funds are supposed to invest solely in the interests of their participants and beneficiaries and for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits. That's the language, solely in the interests of participants and beneficiaries and for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits. And the meaning of that language is a real political football, and it has gone back and forth. In the Clinton administration, under Department of Labor, then Labor Secretary Robert Reich, issued guidance that made it clear that you could take into account environmental, social, and governance factors in making investments. Then when Bush came into office, the Bush DOL issued something much narrower. Then when Obama flipped it back broader again, now we've had a recent shot across the bow with Trump. So this is a bit of a political football, and it's a legal question. What can you appropriately take into account? One of the arguments that I make in the book is that I do think it is appropriate for pension funds like these to, for example, take jobs into account. Now, why do I say jobs? Well, one thing is it's important to remember that the fund really has three sources of funding, any of these pension funds. Okay, one of them is returns, and clearly returns are important and have to remain important and will always remain important. But so is employee contributions to the funds. Those are a source of revenue, and so are employer contributions to the fund. One of the stories I tell in the book is about a pension fund, a number of pension funds, that made an investment through a private equity pool in a company called Aramark. What did Aramark do? Aramark then showed up. So, for example, there's a custodians union in Massachusetts, made an investment in Aramark. Aramark showed up, underbid the custodians union for the school's contract. I talked to a custodian who'd been making $20 an hour. His pay was, he was offered $8.50 an hour. So literally this person's own job, he was invested out of a job with his own retirement funds. And if you're just going to take a returns only view of that, you'd say, oh, well, these trustees did their job. They got returns to the fund. Well, they did so in part by directly undermining the economic interests of the participants and beneficiaries in that fund. So I have argued that economic considerations like that, particularly those that affect the fund, are appropriate. And that's different from going and playing politics with funds, and they're clearly we don't want to do that. But those types of considerations are appropriate. One other comment I want to make on that, if you don't mind, is I take your point, and I think it's true, that pension funds, labor funds, have this other interest too, which is they have their interest in labor and in jobs. And oftentimes the attack on them is, oh, you're just special interest, special interest, special interest. The reality is that all investors in the marketplace have some sort of special interest. Mutual funds don't want to get too aggressive at companies where they're simultaneously on the 401k platform of those companies. Analysts at mutual funds don't want to jeopardize the ability to get the CFO on the phone and ask if their earnings per share targets are in range or not. Sovereign wealth funds, it's much discussed about perhaps pursuing national interests alongside investment. So, I sometimes think it's true that these entities do have a particular special interest, but that's also true of many investors, and that isn't a reason to shut them out or disempower them or disable them in some way.
Yeah, so it's it kind of parallels the whole debate, the larger debate about shareholder primacy versus the stakeholder model, and should a company run the company just to maximize firm value, or should it, or can it take into account other stakeholders?
Yes.
So, but I guess in the case of these labor funds, it's governed by ERISA,
Right.
with some specific language and guidance, as opposed to just kind of Delaware case law.
Absolutely. And this is one of the really interesting tensions that I think exists out there right now, which is that the investors, pension funds, labor funds, are governed by basically slightly different fiduciary duties than the investees, than the corporations and the corporate boards. And so you have this very interesting kind of a situation where the investors and the investees are not necessarily governed by the same fiduciary duties. And I think there's, from anybody interested in the legal issues, serious questions to ask, like, why? Are those differences justifiable? The ERISA pension line comes down through trust law. Corporate law is a cousin. They're sort of these bodies of law are cousins, but one might ask if the differences between them are still justified in a time when today CalPERS or the New York City pension funds are every bit as large and massively complex as a big corporation. So that's another interesting thing going forward, is should there be some sort of harmonization of fiduciary duties? There's some reason why there are still meaningful differences, but in any event, you're right. The same kinds of questions are certainly taking place on the corporate side, mirror image, slightly different legal context.
So that's something that doesn't really come up very often, except in kind of small legal circles where we're kind of looking whether there's some wiggle room in there.
Sure.
I used to be on the corporate side, and so the corporate side has this impression of, especially the labor unions, as being what you call, what you refer to as special interests.
Yep.
And they are fixated with executive comp. They are openly characterizing CEOs, even naming them as fat cats, and questioning their morality, making value judgments about these people, saying that they're only there to line their pockets and kind of undermine everybody else. And then the labor funds also delve into things that people would consider social issues, like human rights and these types of things. And the corporates argue, look, this, first of all, the executive comp is just this kind of populist talk, and then the other is really stuff that, these human rights is important, but it really has nothing to do with the business of widget maker. And so how do you kind of respond to this, or how do you address that very hardened corporate view of these funds and their motives?
Yeah, I think that boards that hear these voices from unions, from pension funds, should listen to them, because you know what, that doesn't mean that they should do whatever they say in every circumstance. I recognize that. But I think board members should value those voices, because those are voices, if you look at who these pension funds are, it comes back to where we started about working class shareholder. In my view, these pension funds and labor union funds, if you look at their interests, in my view, not everyone would accept it, I think that their interests better reflect the interests of tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Americans who are middle class, who are working class, looking at the corporate sector. And it's valuable that those board members should hear that voice, not just from outside, but even from inside, from their own shareholders. Because all that language you said about fat cats and this and that, well, that is how a significant percentage, I don't know how high, that is how a significant percentage of Americans perceive the corporate space. And we are in a time now when economic inequality is very much on the agenda, and there's a lot of concern about it. And I think many people see, with some justification, look to the corporate sector and see it as an engine of precisely that inequality that we're so worried about. So I think it's valuable to hear that voice from inside, from your own shareholders. But I also think it shouldn't, and I wouldn't dismiss it so easily and just saying, oh, special interest. Hey, look, take an issue like proxy access. Do you think I should define what proxy access is, or take it proxy access for? Okay.
No, I think
people know what proxy access is. In this, not every audience that I speak to does, but this. Okay, so take an issue like proxy access, right? That was adopted in Dodd-Frank. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable sued the SEC when it implemented a rule, and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals struck it down. And if you read that opinion, which I have, and which I write about in the book, you will see that the main preoccupation of the D.C. Circuit was, who is this proxy access going to empower? It's going to empower public pension funds and labor union funds, special interest shareholders. It will empower special interest shareholders, and they don't really speak for all shareholders, and therefore that's a major concern. It was part of the rationale for striking down the rule. Well, look what happened afterwards. Precisely one of those so-called special interest shareholders, the New York City pension funds, under the leadership of Scott Stringer, precisely the type of shareholder that was described by the DC Circuit as being the special interest problem, went about making proxy access proposals, and they were wildly successful. At company after company, they got a majority of non-special interest shareholders to back them. That says to me something important, which is that yes, maybe these pension funds have certain special interests, but at the same time, they share many other interests with other shareholders, like making sure that their retirement savings are there when those people retire in 20, 30, 40 years. And as a result, even with that special interest, the market backed them on these proxy access proposals and on others. Some of these unions, majority voting was also largely backed by market players. So part of it, the story here is that these entities, maybe they have interests of their own, and sometimes they do pursue them, but they also are in a position to take on some of these challenges that some of the other funds, maybe they think they're good, they don't want to do them. The mutual funds may not want to do them for precisely the reasons of these business conflicts we described before. So, I think that their voices are important and ought to be listened to. They're very important for boards to be thinking about and to be hearing. And that doesn't mean adopting everything, but we don't want to dismiss them outright either.
Sure. Let's, before we wrap up here, what kind of feedback have you gotten about the book and, audiences that you've spoken at, or just from, people that who've read the book?
Well, it's really been very exciting. I think it's clearly for me been the most professionally exciting moment of my career. I have done and am continuing to do a lot of talks, and there have been a number of dimensions. I've done events like these, and will likely do some more corporate audience events. I have also spoken at many national union meetings, American Federation of Teachers, North America's Building Trades. I'm speaking at many of the NCPERS, the big pension conference. And so I'm doing a lot of pension audiences, a lot of the state, Michigan and Mid-America and others, big pension audiences, and academic audiences as well. Many different academic institutions. I'm going over to London, I'm going to be in Tel Aviv, and I'm traveling around the US too. And then media too. I've done some op-eds in the New York Times, the LA Times. So I think that there are two sources of interest in this topic, which is what brought me to it. I think that markets are, it's funny, it's labor's capital. Well, I think the capital is interested in it, and I think that labor is interested in it. I think on the one hand, labor is, particularly post this Supreme Court case, the Janus case, we don't have to get into that, but labor is really looking for new tools in the 21st century and trying to think of where does it go next. On the other hand, companies recognize that this has risen as a power that they have to deal with. It's become a subject of conversation in the boardroom. And lastly, other pieces of the finance sector. You mentioned hedge funds, private equity. So there's a lot of money in these pension funds. There's $3.5 trillion, roughly, if you include the public and the labor funds together, and that's a conservative estimate. They're big financial players, and they're starting to get their hands around how they can use that financial power to advance their economic interests, which I think is entirely appropriate. So, I hope the conversations like these will continue. I hope it'll have some impact. I should say, I can't go into it too much, but I've been talking with a congressman about some potential, maybe some legislative options for some of the ideas of the book. We'll see where it goes, but speaking with policymakers and players in the field has been very gratifying to me, and I hope I'm certainly grateful for this invitation, and I hope all this continues.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you. I mean, this is a very timely issue, especially the discussion around wealth and income inequality in the United States, and kind of the investment industry itself. So much money moving towards passive investing, and that includes the pension funds investment strategy moving in that direction. So so good. So thank you so much for writing the book and for sharing some of your thoughts about it with us today. So once again, The Rise of the Working Class Shareholder, Labor's Last Best Weapon by David Weber from Boston University Law School. Really like to thank you for being here today. It was great to spend some time while you were in New York. And so again, if you have any questions for either David or me about anything we talked about today or the book, feel free to email the Governance Center at governancecenter@conferenceboard.org, and we will try to get back to you with answers. And thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you again next time.